1911, some of the most skilled professionals in their field set out to conquer the South Pole, but they never came back. When the search team finally found them, they uncovered a heartbreaking story of endurance, sacrifice, and a battle against the merciless Antarctic. Towards the end of the 1800s, John Scott and his son Archibald Scott passed away, leaving John's widow and 2 unmarried daughters with almost no means of surviving. The financial responsibility fell to John's remaining son, the Navy officer Robert Falcon Scott. Feeling the weight of the responsibility, he volunteered for a dangerous expedition to Antarctica. At the start of the 20th century, Antarctica was the last great frontier, a place where only the most daring explorers would go, and the South Pole was yet to be claimed. Scott's first expedition to the Antarctic was the Discovery Expedition, which lasted from 1901 to 1904. This expedition made him famous, and when he returned from the Antarctic, he was promoted to captain, married the future artist Kathleen Bruce, and had a son. However, one of his fellow explorers from the Discovery Expedition, Ernest Shackleton, attempted to reach the South Pole a few years after. Shackleton returned after narrowly failing to reach the pole. It seems this stirred something in Scott, as he shortly after this resigned his position in the Navy and focused on funding a new polar expedition. By 1910, Scott and his men embarked on the Terra Nova expedition. Though the main focus of the expedition was scientific, Scott had an ambitious goal in mind: to be the first to reach the South Pole. Though Shackleton was out of the picture for a bit, another explorer also wanted to be the first to reach the pole. This was Roald Amundsen from Norway. Scott's expedition was carefully planned, with every detail accounted for. They had a team of the finest men, carefully calculated routes, and supplies for every stage of the journey. On paper, it was a solid plan. The march towards the pole began on November 1st, 1911, during the brief window of the austral summer. From their base at Cape Evans, Scott's team, 16 men in total, set off across the vast, featureless wasteland of the Ross Ice Shelf. It was an exhausting push forward, divided into different units. Motor sledges took the lead, followed by teams of ponies and dogs, pulling their heavy cargo. It was slow, but it was progress. However, already on the first day, disaster struck. The motor sledges, pulling much of the weight, failed after a mere 50 miles. Without them, the men now faced the brutal reality of pulling hundreds of pounds of supplies on their own. Despite this setback, they carried on towards the pole. Then, just as they reached the base of the towering Beardmore Glacier on December 4th, the weather turned against them. A fierce blizzard pinned them down, forcing them to burn through rations meant for a later part of the journey. When the storm had passed, they carried on with the next step of their plan. Captain Scott ordered the ponies to be shot so they could cache their meat for their return journey. More men were sent back to base camp, among them Cecil Mears, a key member of the team in charge of the dogs. He was given an important mission: to meet the returning party with the dog teams to help them home. The dogs weren't just for transport, they were lifelines. They could haul equipment, carry supplies, and most importantly, save the exhausted frostbitten men from having to drag their own sledges across the ice. If Mears didn't reach them in time, the consequences would be devastating. Pushing forward, Scott and his remaining men began their brutal ascent up the Beardmore Glacier on December 20th. Every step was a battle. Sheer inclines, hidden crevasses, and constant exhaustion tested them at every turn. As they climbed higher, Scott made another cut. On December 22nd, he sent back 4 more men: Atkinson, Cherry Garrard, Wright, and Keohane. They were told in no uncertain terms that the dog teams must meet them at the prearranged location to aid their return. And if Scott's team wasn't there, the dogs were to go looking for them. January 3rd, 1912. The moment had come. Captain Scott made the final cut, choosing the 4 men who would accompany him in the last push to the South Pole: Edward Wilson, Lawrence Oates, Henry Bowers, and Edgar Evans. 5 men in total. It was one more than originally planned, a seemingly small change, but one that meant recalculating everything. More weight to haul, more rations to stretch, more strain on bodies already pushed to their limits. With the decision made, Lieutenant Evans, along with Lashley and Crean, turned back toward base camp, beginning their own perilous return journey. They were the last people to see the polar team alive. Meanwhile, back at base camp, something crucial was happening, or rather, not happening. On January 5th, Cecil Mears arrived with the dog team. He had been one of the first sent back and was given clear, direct orders. When Scott's team was on their way back, he must take the dogs to meet them. This was not a suggestion. This was survival. But Mears did nothing. He ignored the order. He simply left. On January 28th, Atkinson, the man Scott had personally reminded to send out the dogs, finally arrived at base camp. He now found himself in an unexpected leadership role, one he wasn't prepared for. There were tasks to juggle, decisions to make, and in the chaos, the most vital one of all kept slipping further down the list. The dogs had to leave by February 12th, but that deadline came and went. Finally, on February 13th, Atkinson set out. But just as he began his journey, nature struck them with a significant blow. A brutal blizzard roared in, stopping him in his tracks. The chance to reach Scott's team was slipping away. On February 19th, another emergency arose. Someone at base camp needed urgent medical attention. Atkinson, being a doctor first and a leader second, made a fateful choice. He stayed behind, prioritizing the sick man over Scott's team. He wrote a note to Cape Evans, instructing Cherry Garrard to take the dogs and meet Scott's team, but the note took time to reach its destination. Cherry Garrard was not able to leave until the 26th of February, which was 14 days after the dog team was supposed to leave base camp. Cherry Garrard and his team reached the one-ton depot on March 3rd. They expected to find Scott waiting, but were met with a haunting silence. No one was there. Now, Cherry Garrard faced a difficult decision. He could stay and wait as long as their rations allowed, or push south, hoping to intercept Scott's team before they collapsed entirely. By their calculations, they could manage 4 dog marches before they'd have to turn back. Cherry Garrard stood in silence, eyes lost in the endless white, as he contemplated what he should do. The temperature had plummeted to nearly negative 40 degrees. Visibility was low because of the blizzard, and their rations were dwindling. The south was nothing but a howling, featureless void. He had no way of knowing, but the decision he was about to make would haunt him for the rest of his life. He stayed. They waited at One Ton Depot for as long as they could, hoping Scott's team would appear. But when their supplies ran low, they had no choice. On March 10th, they turned back. 6 days later, they reached base camp at Cape Evans. Atkinson finally realized the severity of the circumstances. Scott's team were in serious danger. He led one last, desperate rescue attempt on March 26th, pushing toward the ice shelf, praying they weren't too late, but the blizzard stopped them too. They made it only as far as Corner Camp. The 30th of March, Atkinson abandoned any attempts to save them, stating that he was now positive that they had perished. After the Austral winter, they started the search for Scott's team. In just under 2 weeks, they passed the one-ton depot where Cherry Garrard had waited for Scott. Not long after passing the depot, just 11 miles, or 18 kilometers south, they found something. A snowed-down tent. Inside the tent, they found the 3 bodies of Edward Adrian Wilson, Henry Robertson Bowers, and Robert Falcon Scott. The sight of the bodies horrified some of the members of the search team. As they read his journal, they learned how the polar team had met their end. Back on January 9th, Scott's team had crossed a historic milestone. They passed Shackleton's farthest south point. A fleeting moment of triumph, but one quickly overshadowed by the worsening conditions. Temperatures were dropping far below what was normal for this time of year. Their sledges, already difficult to pull, now dragged like dead weight over a surface as unyielding as desert sand. Unknown to Scott's team, these conditions were the kind that only occurred once every 15 years in the Antarctic. And then, on January 17th, their greatest fear became reality. Ahead, fluttering in the relentless wind, a Norwegian flag. Scott's heart sank. They were too late. By just 5 weeks, Roald Amundsen had beaten them to the pole. The crushing weight of failure settled over them. In his diary, Scott wrote, "The pole. Yes, but under very different circumstances from those expected. This is an awful place, and terrible enough for us to have labored to it without the reward of priority." With heavy hearts, they took photographs and turned back. The return journey was always going to be grueling, but Scott's journal revealed that his team was deteriorating fast. The unexpected setbacks and challenges had taken a huge toll on the team, and Edgar Evans's strength was failing, and Lawrence Oates's feet were badly frostbitten. They had to reach their rendezvous point where they would be met by the relief team with the dogs. As Scott's team was descending the Beardmore Glacier, Edgar Evans was struggling because of his injuries. What made matters worse was that he fell into a crevasse, injuring his head. The head injury caused him to fall more during their descent. Then, on February 16th, with the end of the glacier finally in sight, he collapsed completely, crumpling onto the ice. The next morning, he could no longer keep up. The others had no choice but to leave him behind in the snow, hauling their sleds with every ounce of strength they had left, planning to return for him as soon as they could. But when they did, something was terribly wrong. They found him on his knees, his clothing scattered, hands uncovered and frozen, his eyes wild and unfocused. They pulled him onto a sledge, dragging him to the safety of their tent. But by then, Edgar Evans wasn't conscious. He would never wake up again. By February 27th, and 3 days ahead of schedule, Scott's team had reached their prearranged meeting point with the dog team, but no one was waiting for them, and their situation was getting worse by the hour. Lawrence Oates's frostbite had worsened, turning into gangrene. They were barely covering 5 miles a day, and 1 Ton Depot, their only hope of salvation, was still more than 60 miles away. They pushed forward mile by mile, desperately hoping the dogs would arrive in time to save them. By March 15th, Lawrence Oates could barely move. His hands and feet were useless. Every step was agony. He begged for the others to leave him behind, but Scott and the others refused. Then, on the 16th or 17th of March, something in Scott's mind shifted. The dog team should have met them by now. Why weren't they here? Had he somehow missed them? Had they been abandoned? Scott and his team came to a horrifying realization. They were on their own. Nobody was coming. As he wrestled with these thoughts, Oates pushed himself to his feet and was about to walk out of the tent. The others knew exactly what Oates meant to do. They immediately tried to dissuade him, but he wouldn't have it. In the end, he looked at each of them in turn. Then, with quiet resolve, he spoke the last words they would ever hear from him. "I'm just going outside, and maybe some time." Oates knew the brutal truth. None of them would make it at this pace. His failing body was holding them back, and yet his friends would never leave him behind. So, in an act of quiet heroism, he stepped out of the tent in the hope that it would save his friends. He faded away into the storm, one selfless step at a time. The remaining 3 men continued. With help not coming, their only chance to survive was making it to 1 Ton Depot. They now moved much faster across the white wasteland. On March 20th, they were just 11 miles, or 18 kilometers, from 1 Ton Depot. Safety was almost within reach. But then, the storm came. A raging blizzard slammed into them, a white wall of ice and wind. They were trapped. Day after day, they tried to push forward, but their bodies were failing, their strength was gone. On March 29, 1912, Scott picked up his journal for the last time, and he began to write. "Every day we have been ready to start for our depot 11 miles away, but outside the door of the tent, it remains a scene of whirling drift. I do not think we can hope for any better things now. We shall stick it out to the end, but we are getting weaker, of course, and the end cannot be far. It seems a pity, but I do not think I can write more. R. Scott." Last entry. Among those who found Scott was Apsley Cherry Garrard, the man who had led the relief team, the man who had been just 11 miles away from them. He stared down at the frozen bodies of his friends, the weight of how close he had come, cut him deeper than anything else in his life ever would. If he had gone just a little farther, just a little longer, then maybe Scott, Bowers, and Wilson would have survived. The weight of that knowledge never left him. He tried to move on. He returned to his work as a zoologist, tried to find comfort in the company of the dogs he had once led across the ice, but it was no use. The expedition haunted him. Just a few years later, he could no longer work. He never recovered. He spiraled into depression, consumed by guilt, tormented by the question, could I have saved them? This, as well as other symptoms, point to him having post-traumatic stress disorder. But back then, there was no name for what he suffered. He sought solace in writing, pouring his pain into a book, The Worst Journey in the World. It became one of the greatest true adventure stories ever told. As for Scott and his team, there was no bringing them home. The search party collapsed the tent around their bodies, building a snow cairn over them. At its peak, they placed a cross, fashioned from skis, marking their final resting place in the heart of the Antarctic. Scott left behind a wife and a 2-year-old son, as well as his 2 unmarried sisters and mother, who had depended on him financially. Wilson left behind a wife of 11 years. Bowers left behind his mother and sister. Edgar Evans's body was never found. His wife of 8 years and their 3 children would never have a grave to visit. Instead, a plaque in a Norman church at Rosilly is all that remains of his memory. And then there was Lawrence Oates. They never found him. As they reached the place where he had wandered on his own into the vast emptiness, they were only able to find his sleeping bag. They raised a simple stone cairn where they believed he had fallen. On it they carved his legacy. Hereabouts died a very gallant gentleman, Captain Elliot G. Oates, of the Inniskilling Dragoons. In March 1912, returning from the pole, he walked willingly to his death in a blizzard to try and save his comrades beset by hardships.